Well, hey everybody, it's Marcus. I'm your host. This is the Kingdom Project podcast, and thanks for joining me on another episode. So we're going to continue some of the eschatology stuff, and this will help understand a little bit more of the dispensational pre-millennial view that holds to a 7-year great tribulation. So we're going to be talking about that in this episode. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, and hopefully you'll be able to understand. So we're going to be looking at Daniel 9. So here's the thing, that there's a lot of people that are waiting for the fulfillment of certain Old Testament promises, and that has shaped their eschatology. And that's unfortunate because instead of embracing that those things have been fulfilled and that Jesus has inaugurated the kingdom in a already but not yet sense, they have pushed all of that off to a future age that will follow the end times. All right. And so the view is reinforced by several misinterpretations of various portions of Scripture, and the one we are focusing on, like I said, is Daniel 9. So we're going to have to understand it correctly, we're going to have to look at the common understanding with the futurist, in which the events of Daniel 9 are actually grafted into the timeline of the book of Revelation and then applied to the distant future, okay? So first on the timeline is the rapture of the true church, leaving no Christians on earth. We've talked about that last episode. Then the sun, the moon, and the stars are all supposed to fall to the earth and to do some damage. That should just totally eradicate this whole concept or theology in the first place. The sun, the moon, and stars are supposed to fall on the earth. That's complete destruction, okay? So, all right, anyway, the mark at 3.5 years is significant because prior to it, the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And during this new temple period, for 3.5 years, animal sacrifices and the old covenant will be reinstituted and honored by God. Yeah, so according to that, the temple must be rebuilt before the rise of the final figure on this timeline, which is the Antichrist, right? At the halfway mark, the Antichrist will come and sit down in the new temple, which they call they take the phrase, the abomination that causes desolation, from Matthew 24 and the other parallels of that, all right? Because of the Antichrist, God then will release his wrath in an unprecedented measure on the entire earth. And at the end of this tribulation, Jesus returns. He lands in Jerusalem, when he will sit on a throne for 1,000 years as the king who finally fulfills the Davidic covenant promises. So according to futurists, like, all of these will happen in the future over a period of 7 years, all right? So this is the common understanding, but it contradicts a proper understanding of the biblical covenants, right? Because Jesus fully fulfilled the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants. There's no need of a future fulfillment of those covenant promises because they've been fulfilled. So we're going to focus on just one aspect, all right, that 7-year tribulation, all right, because it is the foundation of the timeline upon which this whole theory sits. But as I said before, there is no 7-year period that's mentioned, all right? It's not mentioned in Revelation. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Gospels of the Olivet Discourse, okay? That's Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. It's not mentioned at all in the entire New Testament, all right? So John Darby, in the 1800s, all right? They believed in this. They came up with this, I think. So it's a pretty important missing piece in modern futurist belief. Okay, so where do they get this idea from? All right, so I mentioned the book The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey in the last episode. Okay, and this was a huge book in the 70s. It's because of that, his influence, all right, due to that influence, due to Darby, due to the Schofield Bible, even the Ryrie Bible, okay, it's influenced how people read and understand the Bible, all right, and they don't understand covenants or how to properly study the Bible, so the modern church is embraced into its foundation futurism and dispensationalism. All right, so and like I said, wrong understanding of Daniel 9. All right, so the historical understanding of Daniel 9, Daniel was a captive Israelite in Babylon following the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. And while a captive, he read from the book of Jeremiah, in which Jeremiah had prophesied that judgment was coming, and this prophecy was fulfilled in the Babylonian invasion. In Jeremiah's prophecy, Daniel also saw that the Israelites would be in captivity for 70 years. Okay, so he began to pray about the nearing end of the 70 years of captivity, asking God to release Israel from captivity so they could return to their nation and land. And this prayer was later answered, and it's recorded in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. All right, so while Daniel was praying, he had this angelic encounter. And we're in Daniel 9 and 20 and 21, and while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill, while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice, all right? And he gives a prophecy to Daniel that states that 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. All right. So he lists 6 activities, and he says that 77s had been decreed for them. And then know and understand this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Okay, so without any dispensational thinking, the phrase the anointed one should automatically make us think of Jesus. This is the common way to refer to him in Scripture, or the Messiah. Yet Darby actually interpreted the passage to refer to the Antichrist instead. And that's a huge switch, all right? Because Gabriel's prophecy about the anointed one continues. It says, the anointed one, the ruler, comes. there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and cut off. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. All right, this gives such a clear picture of Jesus, who was put to death and who put an end to sacrifice and offering, all right? But futurists see the ending of the sacrifice and offering, which is the old covenant, as a bad thing, which means that the anointed one must be the Antichrist, who will do this in the future. All right, so but it is safe to say that almost everyone before John Darby believed and understood Daniel 9 to be a prophecy of Jesus. Matthew Henry, and I have his commentaries. I recommend them. They're good. He's a renowned commentator. He wrote this about Daniel 9, 24 through 27. He says, "We have in Daniel 9 the most illustrious prediction of Christ and gospel grace that exists in all of the Old Testament." So it's completely mind-boggling how people can turn such a clear and prediction of Jesus into a prophecy about an Antichrist and end times, all right? So here's the thing that trips people up. It's the whole 77s, all right? But scholars in almost all camps agree that this phrase means 70 sets of 7, which is 490. So you take 70 times 7 equals 490. These 7s are understood to indicate years. Okay, some translations use the word weeks instead of 7s. Those were not meant literally, but were a Jewish prophetic reference to years. Okay, so the 490 refers to 490 years. Okay, so in verse 25 it says, "Jerusalem, until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens." Okay, so another equation. Okay, so 62 sevens are added to 7 sevens, the result of which is 69 sevens. It's 62 plus 7 equals 69. All right, so this means that out of the 77s, all right, out of the 490, 69 of those have already happened, because 69 of the 77s have already happened. That brings us to 483 years. Okay, so this leaves us with just 1 7, or 7 years. And this is pretty much agreed upon by most scholars. Okay, this final 7 is the 7 that's in question. And according to futurist thinking, this is where the 7-year tribulation begins, okay? But the historical interpretation of this passage is quite different. Okay, these 490 years were a time frame given to Daniel in which certain things would happen. All right, in verse 25, Gabriel clarified that this timeline did not start immediately, but only when the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem went forth. From that command until the time when the anointed one would come would be 483 years. That decree to restore and rebuild was later given in Ezra chapter 7, verses 12 through 26, in the year 457 BC. So the timeline starts then in 450 BC and continues, for 490 years. So on the timeline, the initial 69 sevens bring us to the year 27 AD. Jesus was born. That's debated too, but we're going to say Jesus was born in the year 3, which means that in 27 AD, Jesus was 30 years old. That is when he began his public ministry, and that is exactly at the end of the 483 years, which was when the Anointed One was prophesied to appear on the scene. Jesus' earthly ministry lasted 3.5 years, bringing the timeline to 30 AD, when he was put to death, when through his death he put an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, so when Jesus died on the cross, in the eyes of God, he had put it into those things. He had made the old obsolete. He'd made it outdated and soon to fade away. All right, Hebrews 8. All right, so verse 25, speaking of Jerusalem, it will be rebuilt with streets and a trench built in times of trouble. Then after the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. All right, Daniel 9:26. The first part of the verse marks Jesus' crucifixion. The second half then begins speaking of another person, the ruler who will come and destroy Jerusalem and the temple. So it's important to understand this dividing line in verse 26, that after the Anointed One, Jesus, was put to death, the subject logically switches to a different individual. The prophecy about the second individual is the ruler continues, that the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, war will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. This all speaks of the ruler who would come against the city of Jerusalem. All right, so throughout most of church history, this has been interpreted as a reference to General Titus, who destroyed the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD. All right, but in verse 27, the subject switches back to Jesus, saying, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. All right, so this verse looks at the final 7, during which Jesus confirmed a covenant with many through his earthly ministry. In the middle of those 7 years, he put an end to sacrifice and offering through his death. And because we are reading this in English and do not understand the structure of the prophecy, we can miss the back and forth that happens between the two characters in the prophecy. But this was understood throughout the church history until John Darby, who changed it to be solely about the Antichrist. All right, so what we actually have in Daniel 9 is a 5-part prophecy about the Messiah and the events surrounding the introduction of the new covenant. Okay, so it tells the year of the Messiah's arrival. It literally predicts the exact year when Jesus appeared on the scene to start his ministry in 27 AD. It tells of his death. It tells of the end of the old covenant. All right, the end to sacrifice and offering, and that's the end of the old covenant there. And then it tells of the confirming of a new covenant. All right, and this is what's meant by the statement in verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for the 1 7. In other words, Jesus would establish the new covenant. And then it tells the destruction of Jerusalem. All 5 of these appear in this 4 verses. All right, so in brief, 483 years, okay, from 457 BC to 27 AD, led up to Jesus' appearance as the Messiah, all right? The first half of the last 7 years was Jesus' earthly ministry, which culminated in 30 AD when Jesus put an end to sacrifice and established the new covenant through his death and resurrection. He did not actually stop. He doesn't stop them from sacrificing animals, but he did put an end to the old covenant in the eyes of God at that time. And so now Jesus is the perfect sacrifice, making the old covenant null and void. So after that, another 3.5 years remain, bringing the timeline to 33 AD. Okay, so before we look at that last 3.5 years, we'll look briefly at the reference that Jesus made to this prophecy in Daniel 9. In Matthew 18, 21 and 22, where it says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, 'I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. The use of 77 times was an allusion to Daniel 9, which was very well known and debated, and a debated prophecy during the first century. So the Jews recognized that Daniel's 69 weeks were running out, and the Anointed One was about to show up, and they're looking for him. So everyone was anxiously awaiting to see what would be happening. And this is why that period in history saw such an influx of false messiahs. And the general thought was, we are completing the end of the Daniel 9 prophecy, all right? Jesus used this prophecy to teach Peter a lesson on forgiveness, all right? So when he says that Peter should forgive 70 times 7, he was alluding to the 490-year grace period that God had given in Daniel 9 for Israel to get their act together. So he's not, as it's often taught, using a big number to mean infinity. All right, and instead he was referring to a prophecy that everyone would have known and been familiar with, and was talking about it in order to say that we should be as forgiving as God, who has given Israel 490 years of grace. In the context then here, the point is that Daniel 9 was well known. The Jews were on the lookout, and yet they crucified him because they had not prepared their hearts to receive him and his new covenant. So that brings us to that last 3.5 years. That after Jesus' death and resurrection, according to Daniel 9 timeline, 3.5 years still remained in that 490-year grace period for Israel. So those last 3.5 years bring us to the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7. When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." At this, they covered their eyes, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he fell on his knees and cried out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. This is in Acts 7, 54 through 59. This marks the end of the 490-year period, that season when the Israelites were to prepare for and accept Jesus as their Messiah. And with the stoning of Stephen, that window closed. God had opened an opportunity for Israel to understand and receive Jesus even under the old covenant. And this is exactly what Stephen is explaining in his monologue before the Sanhedrin. But they rejected this message, and instead they stoned him to death as a heretic. So this does not mean that no Jews were saved after that. It's, it means that the opportunity for the Jews to see Jesus under the old covenant before its destruction had ended. And by stoning Stephen, they were sealing their fate. They sealed their fate, which Jesus had declared over them in Matthew 23, when he says, "So upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation." So at the end of 33 AD, the Jews chose the old covenant and rejected Messiah. Not long after, the church began to launch out from Jerusalem to the surrounding nations, and welcoming Gentiles into the kingdom. So the end of the 490 years marked this whole paradigm shift. All right, 3 chapters later, Peter received the vision in which God told him not to call unclean what he has called clean, which is the Gentiles. And now that the gospel is for everyone, and it was always intended for everyone, but it could have been for everyone while involving Israel in a much greater way. Okay, so there's one last part in Daniel 9, this abomination of desolation. This may take a little bit. We will see. But the abomination that causes desolation. Okay, and Jesus mentioned this part of Daniel 9 and Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse. "See, when you are standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. Let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Okay, so Jesus quotes the last verse of Daniel 9. He expected those listening to understand, and Matthew even adds, "Let the reader understand." So it wasn't a hard concept to them, okay, when this was happening. This is why historical, first century historical, and grammatical context is so important in interpreting the Bible. It referred to something that those who heard Jesus would have been able to recognize when they saw it, so they could flee to the mountains, all right? So, yeah, now that I've opened up the whole can of Matthew 24, I'll have to do an episode on that too. Even if you are a futurist and all that, you got to take Matthew 24 out of futuristic eschatology and prophecy. It doesn't work. It does not fit. It has happened. If you have a Bible like the ESV, it will say right at the beginning of chapter 24 in Matthew, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's what Matthew 24, Jesus' prophecy is about. It's not something 2,000 years removed. It happened within that generation's time. All right. So, it made sense to them. All right. We know it did because, since they did in fact escape Jerusalem by fleeing to the mountains. All right. So we're going to have to look at the verses following this, okay? So when he says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, okay? Let no one on the housetop go down and to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. All right, so these verses put the abomination of desolation in a historical context. Okay, again, historical context. All right, pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. Okay, this puts it in the first century because it was illegal for a Jew to walk more than 3/4 of a mile on the Sabbath. So if they needed to flee on the Sabbath, it would have been difficult to get very far without being arrested for violating the Sabbath. Let no one on the housetop go down. This is also places this in an earlier time period because it was common for people to have houses with flat roofs where people spent a lot of time. So Jesus was saying, hey, if you're on the roof, don't take time to go back inside. Just get out. The nursing, pregnant women and nursing mothers, all right? That's the difficulty of traveling from Jerusalem into the mountains on foot while either pregnant or nursing a baby. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountain, all right? More than any of the others, this indicates that this was a localized event that only applied to those living in Judea. So after describing all this which they should flee, Jesus told them about the severity of what would happen when he says, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Here's another clue that this event cannot be at the end of the world. If these events were scheduled to happen at the end of human history, Jesus would have had no reason to say, and never to be equaled again. All right. So the phrase indicated that history would continue on after this happened. Some people have said it must happen at the end of the world because, in their opinion, there's more, has been worse events than the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But yeah, if you're going to put numbers, if you're going to put numbers to it, then yeah, the destruction was not the worst event. But Jesus was not trying to say that it would be the worst event ever, but that it would be the worst event in the history of the Jews. And when we consider not only the suffering and the bloodshed of that event, but also the ramifications on Judaism, we can without a doubt claim that in 70 AD was in fact the worst event in the history of the Jewish people. It was the end of their world. That after the Babylonian destruction, the Jews were able to return and rebuild, all right? But even 1900 years after the Roman destruction, the Jews still do not have a temple. The records of the priesthood have been destroyed. So even if they do rebuild the temple, they don't have the means to authentically reestablish the priesthood of Levites. In 70 AD, the entire Jewish world and the whole system collapsed in a way that it can never recover from. All right, beyond the destruction of that city, there, like I said, the temple was destroyed. The whole priesthood, about 8,500 priests were put to death. 1.1 million Jews were killed, many in horrific ways. I'm not going to go into that. You can read it in The Antiquity of the Jews by Josephus. And then, all the genealogical records were burned up, which meant they could never again set up a real legitimate Levitical priesthood. Okay, so Judaism transitioned from Mosaic Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism. The modern version of Judaism is not even connected to the old version because they are no longer able to gather at the proper temple or offer the required sacrifices. They don't have a priesthood. So the destruction was world collapsing event for them. Okay, so, but that doesn't really tell us exactly what Jesus is referring to when he mentions the abomination of desolation, but in the parallel passages that are in the other Gospels, we find it there. And so I don't know why people miss this, all right? So in Luke 21, 20 through 24, he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee, and he goes on to finish the rest, all right? There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all nations, all right? So here he says that the abomination that causes desolation would be the armies surrounding Jerusalem to lay it desolate. The armies came and destroyed Jerusalem, were the abomination that caused the desolation. He's saying that when you see the armies flee for the hills. And that's exactly what the early Christians did. 1.1 million non-believing Jews stayed in Jerusalem and were killed, but not one Christian remained in Jerusalem. Every single Christian fled to a nearby Mount Pella when they saw Roman armies. So it's during that retreat, they all those in the city quickly fled, and they fled. The rest of the Jews stayed in Jerusalem because there was a bunch of stuff if you read Josephus. So, but this contrast between the actions of the Christians and the non-believing Jews is one of the strongest proofs of this interpretation in Matthew 24. And Jesus was clearly warning them about what would happen, and they heeded his warning. They followed his command to flee, and they were saved from destruction. And history proves it was an amazingly accurate prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so through Jesus' prophecy about the abomination of desolation, we should clearly understand what Daniel 9 means. That Jesus was going to come in 27 AD and confirm a covenant with many. And Jesus actually used that exact language in Matthew 26:28 when he says, "This is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people, and it is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many." And he confirmed his covenant for many there. And Jesus was actually paraphrasing from and probably intentionally referencing Daniel 9. After confirming the covenant, he puts an end to sacrifice through his own death in 30 AD. And in 33 AD, the 490-year window of grace was closed, and history began moving toward the climax of the Daniel 9 prophecy in the destruction of the city. and the sanctuary through the abomination of desolation, which happened in 70 AD. And from that point forward in history, we are now we now are in an eternal covenant, and the kingdom has been inaugurated by Jesus. And even though it's already, but not yet, this is an unshakable kingdom. The old covenant is gone. The kingdom is advancing and working its way like leaven through the whole loaf. It's like a mustard seed growing. The kingdom of the new covenant has the law of love one another as I have loved you. And these truths free us from legalism, racism, sexism, and the belief of an angry God. All right, so I hope that makes sense for y'all. That's the proper interpretation of Daniel 9 and the 490 years. We are not in a pause where the dispensationalists say after that 489 year, he paused the prophetic timetable, and we are now in a parenthesis because since the Jews rejected him, he decided to go with plan B and die on the cross for the Gentiles. So we were never really included. It was plan B. There's two peoples now, according to them. So we are in this huge pause, this huge parentheses. And when the time of the Gentiles are full, then we'll be raptured. And then those last 7 years will pick right up. And it's a complete misunderstanding or misinterpretation. It's a complete lie is what it is. And it's not true. It was precise, and it happened just the way it was prophesied, and it's fulfilled. Well, okay, there you guys go. I hope that was simplistic. I hope you learned from that. I'm sorry if it boggled your mind, or if you feel scandalized, because I did for a long time trying to figure this stuff out. So, questions, comments, discussions on Facebook, whatever, send me an email at thekingdomprojectpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, be that mustard seed, be that leaven, and thank you so much for listening.